So our panel is on welfare and social assistance. So obviously extremely important, a big user of taxes, but not big enough. Look, I can answer that in two ways. One is a big statement. One is, I think one of the biggest things we've got to do is to regain trust in the tax system. Everybody talks about a tax burden instead of, it's probably going a bit too far to say the privilege of paying taxes, but we really need to regain the trust in the tax system. On a more kind of granular level, obviously we're interested in those who have the least at the moment getting some more of that parcel so that we drive more equality. And really the group that we know have it toughest are those who are on working age payments. If we can get that to the poverty line, then we actually see, and Anglicare Australia's research over and over again shows that once people don't have to worry about literally where the next meal's coming from, they can actually start to spend time in future-facing activities, whether that's study, actually really looking for jobs, not just doing the hamster wheel of obligations, savings, but looking forward. And that's what we see when people have enough money across our network. We work with 1 in 19 Australians, and what we see when people have enough money is they start to look to the future in all those ways. Look, I think there's a few. There's this thought that there's a scarcity. So whenever we put forward the thought that we should increase welfare benefits, or we should have more money for children in care, or more money for aged care, we hear politicians say to us, I agree, but I need to find the money. Where would you make the cuts? So I think we need to lose this scarcity thought. We need to think about what is the gold star of what we want for our society, and then think about how we enable that to happen. So I think that's one of the things, this scarcity myth that we sort of have thrown at us and we all take on board. I think another issue for the not-for-profits is that prevention is always so much better for the individual, better for the environment, whatever service you're looking at, but it's also cheaper. And I think about aged care, for example, and if somebody is able to stay in their own home to have aged care, it's about a quarter of the cost of if they need to go into residential care. Now, when we look at people who are renting in the private market and on the pension, they are really living in poverty to find that private rental money. That means that often they are needing to access residential care before they're ready for it and before it's ready for them. So massive cost. So that thought that prevention actually is so much better than the cure often, and that's a very difficult message for us to get through, because often the government wants to see, well, how many people did you cure? It's a lot more difficult to say how much poverty we prevented. So that's something that we've got to get better at evidencing and help governments and the community to perhaps get away from counting the number of people who've caught that ambulance at the bottom of the cliff and thinking about how many people have managed to avoid falling off the cliff because of the fences at the top. I think we all need to remember there are so many myths, and look, we're living in a time when we can talk about myths and fake news and all those things, but even for myself, with very strong beliefs in a collective, it is very hard to grasp statistics about how we are taxed and whether we're a high-paying nation or a low-paying nation. I know we don't pay a lot of tax. We are very interested in looking at how we tax wealth as well as income. And I know from our own investigations that we don't tax wealth at all. So I know and understand that we are a low taxed nation, and yet there are so many statistics that say otherwise. So I think that is very difficult for most people whose day-to-day job is not about thinking about tax. But I do think that we all need to remember what we get for tax. I go back to that's a couple of decades ago when someone talked about a tax refund being worth a hamburger and a milkshake. A hamburger and a milkshake is worth nothing to me, but not having to wait for 18 months to get a shoulder operation is. Knowing that somebody on a remote community in Arnhem Land has the same rights for their children to access healthcare as I do living in Canberra is worth it to me. So that sort of small pennies in my purse really doesn't mean a lot when you think of what it can mean when it's all put together. So I think there is an understanding that we could do well to foster that, you know, in the words of the song, we're all in this together. And if we view that as a collective, then I think we get more trust back in tax. But we also need to remember that, you know, it's not just housing and schools and health, because sometimes when I have this conversation, people who are relatively well off will say to me, well, we've taken ourselves out of the education system, so we're not costing that anything because our children go to a private school. Well, first of all, we can dispute that, but we also need to think about all the other goods that come from living in a society, our roads, our defence, our diplomatic service, all the things that we don't often think about when we're interested in welfare. So I think there's that about the actual privilege of living in a society that has taxes that do those jobs, so we can just leave our house and expect to have ambulances and roads and all those things. And I think there's also a knowledge about the other side of it. It would be great if we could all just know that poverty does exist in Australia. It does affect us all. I might not be living in poverty, but the fact that someone else has effect on my moral life, but also my economic life, and that poverty is a choice. And it is a choice of the taxation system. It's a choice for us to actually make that tax system work to end poverty. Look, I think the government itself is between a bit of a rock and a hard place with this kind of language. Tax has become a dirty word. It shouldn't be. It is a privilege to pay tax. It is a privilege to move in cleanish air, to have roads, to have fresh water, and we need to accept that all that has come about because of tax. So I feel for the government, but I think governments need to not buy into that. I think they need to find ways to connect with people who feel they're overtaxed. We did some callback radio last week on wealth taxes. I am very well aware that there's a great hostility in amongst people who aren't wealthy towards taxes on wealth. It is quite a difficult thing to understand. So I understand that governments are in a bit of a hard place. I think that they could work with the not-for-profit sector. They could borrow some of our social license to talk about these things. And I think some of our ways to work with government, we need to give them solutions, but we also need to make sure that we're keeping our eye on the bigger prize, which is a fair and equitable society and a tax system that funds that. Again, I think the big kind of narrative one is let's get some trust, let's trust tax. That there might be a kind of Trumpist sort of slogan in there somewhere, you know, let's make tax great again or something. I'm not sure. But to gain trust in tax and those systems. But I think, again, I come back to thinking about, you know, the tax system in my head, in my mind, really should be about, you know, redistribution of wealth. That wealth has often, by the way, been brought about by the taxation system. So it's often been provided to people by the tax system. So we need to get that and get it to those people who are currently at the lowest point of the socioeconomic strata. And so that really does look like working age payments. It really, you know, that's going to make the most difference. And then we'll see a different group who need bringing up, and a different group. But those working age payments, we need to be saying, these are not temporary payments for most people any longer. It is not the person's fault that they are out of work. It's often something structural. So we need to share that, and we need to actually make sure that people who are out of work, of working age, have an adequate income to live a decent life, to have decent housing, and to have hope that they are able to do future-based activities to either get work or participation and housing and all that goes with that.